This site was erased from history, but someone lived long enough to talk. From above, the mountain looks ordinary. A green thumb pushing up from the valley, tree lines scalloped like an old haircut, a white ribbon of road that snakes to a parking clear-cut and then just stops. But when you zoom in, the topo betrays it. Straight cuts in the rock, a low concrete lip at the summit, and, tucked between the trees, a scattering of pillboxes like teeth. That thin road was our invitation and our warning. Emily and I packed water, helmets, and a stubborn amount of curiosity, and we hiked up to see what had been left behind. If you love forgotten places, hit subscribe. It really helps us keep digging. We started in the village below. Stone houses with shutters that have outlived their owners, an 18th century castle with one wall collapsing in on its own stories, and a well that still runs sweet and cold. The village felt lived in, clotheslines, a cat that inspected our backpacks like it owned the trail, and a handful of carved dates on the castle stone, a spider web of human time layered across the place. You could feel history breathing in the mortar, Roman roadways beneath a modern vineyard, medieval fortifications reshaped for later wars. That mixture is why defensive mountains like this exist. Borders are never just lines on a map. They are architecture and labor. We spoke with the woman at the small municipal office who pointed to a laminated map, not of tourist trails but of installations, with half-faded ink and bureaucratic stamps. She shrugged when I asked about records. "There are files," she said, "but they are thin." That was the first hint of the erasure. On paper, the mountain was a blank with a few penciled notes. On the ground, the evidence was far louder. The trail itself starts innocently, a mule path through bee-scented wildflowers and a postcard view over the valley. Then the incline takes over. Heat becomes physical when you are exposed above tree line. The sun hammered down through the pack, and sweat soaked my shirt in the first 10 minutes. We passed an old shepherd's hut, half burned, a chimney that still smelled faintly of smoke, and an embankment where stones had been forced to keep the path usable. That human effort hinted at habitability. People here regularly for decades. Halfway up, the trees thin and the first pillbox appears, half buried in a bank of bracken. Concrete, pitted and lichen-stained, corners worn soft by time. It faces the valley with a slit for observation and a rusted ring where a periscope once pivoted. Inside we found a pan, a jar with petrified preserves, and a single boot sole. Nothing glamorous, the artifacts of small, mundane life, but unmistakably human. Someone cooked, slept, and kept watch here. Graffiti and shaky pencil set a date, 1939, scrawled where the concrete met earth. You don't need a signed memoir to understand the fact of presence. There were more remains as we climbed. Concrete collars for ventilation, shortcuts in the ridge where rock had been quarried to make room for armor, and the faint tramline bed that slices a path left-right at an angle that makes no sense unless something heavy was hauled. The summit, when we broke the last tree line, was not a single bunker but a low, battered complex half dug into the mountain. Rows of blast shielding, blocks of reinforced concrete like teeth in the skyline, and a pair of angular doors, one boarded and one sealed with rust. A chimney taller than the rest hinted at stoves below that once fed a lot of mouths. We hesitated at the base of the main entrance. There are two important things to say before we go any further. First, this place is old, dangerous, and likely on private or controlled land. We did not force entry into sealed rooms, and we did not publish precise coordinates. Second, the air below can be hazardous. Old explosives, trapped gases, unstable masonry. We wore helmets, carried a gas meter, and kept to the parts we could access without cutting new holes or breaking boards. Exploration on camera is responsible exploration. The point here is to document, not to encourage risk. We moved slowly into the complex, and the light changed. The roofline absorbs color, outside blues flatten, and inside everything turns slate and ochre. The tunnel mouth was lined with soot from generations of lamps. The first corridor smelled of damp and metal. There were staircases, one of them carved clean and steep, their edges smoothed by boots over decades. A narrow gauge track ran along the floor, a rail line with ties still in place, corroded but unmistakable. heading deeper, as if an unseen train had once whispered supplies into the mountain. The scale of the interior surprised me. From outside, the summit looked like a single bunker. Inside, it was a maze. Storage rooms stacked with wooden crates, a rail spur tucked into a loading bay, toilets with faded tile, a room with hooks for hanging gear, and a cold kitchen with a rusted boiler and an iron chimney that led up through the earth. In one storage chamber, a wall had been hammered to let carts pass. The scar lines of an improvisation made during haste or necessity. Marks on the crates were eroded, but stencil patterns remained. Letters and numbers that suggested organized supply chains rather than field improvisation. We found the logistics evidence in the clumsiest, most unapologetic ways. A set of rails anchored to stone dropped down into a vanishing corridor. Outward-facing embrasures showed how someone could cover the valleys. A loading platform held fragments of rope and canvas. One crate still bore a faded stamp where the paint clung like a ghost. It was obvious this was not a hideout for a handful of men. This was infrastructure meant to hold and move a lot of material. We also found the domestic traces that make history human. A toilet block with a cracked ceramic basin, names and dates carved into a bunk post, a child's makeshift wooden toy, round and clumsy, half buried in dust, which made everything feel unbearably real. If you want to empathize with the people who manned these places, find their toothbrush, find the chipped mug, find the ring of soot on the mantel where someone set a tin to boil. Those things tell you more than strategy diagrams ever can. At deeper levels, water becomes a player. One passage was half flooded, black, glassy, reflecting the beam of our lamps and the underside of the ceiling. There are natural springs up here, and the builders worked around them. Where water pooled, silt and debris had settled into a history of stillness. In that stillness, we noticed animal bones. Not gruesome, but present. Reminders that nature reclaims and rewrites. We found a collapsed blast door, its hinges torn out of the masonry, a metal frame like a mouth frozen open. Nearby, rusted plaques warned of danger in small, bureaucratic fonts. These signs are literal. The men who left them were aware of the hazards and tried to mitigate them. That bureaucratic language is itself a form of testimony. Physically, getting around was not easy. The hike up had drained our water faster than we expected. The descent through the tunnels made it worse because exertion continues even in the cool dark. There were moments when my headlamp caught on long spider silk and flinched like the eyelash of a giant. Flies buzzed in old kitchens. Bats stirred overhead. Even in the relative shelter, the heat from the mountain pressed outward like a held breath. You can imagine then the conditions for the soldiers or workers who lived here. Wet boots, cold iron, rationed water, nights by lamplight, and the constant hum of logistical worry. So why does the site feel erased? On paper, it is thinly documented. On the ground, it is incised with human labor. There are a few reasons a place like this slips from public history. Records may be scattered across local and national archives or have been lost during later turmoil. Some installations were classified, kept out of maps for decades. Others were deliberately dismantled when they became obsolete, and their paperwork was folded into other dossiers. In peacetime, priorities shift. Budgets go elsewhere. A structure decays and memories fade as the last veterans pass on. What remains is what can be touched and photographed, not necessarily what is written down. Which brings us to the title promise. Someone lived long enough to talk. We did not, in this specific shoot, find a living veteran in our interviews willing to be filmed at length. There are, however, echoes, fragments of voice in the objects and archives we examined that allowed us to reconstruct the human side of this place. To make that human voice clear, we did two things. First, we collected material artifacts, dated graffiti, crate markings, and municipal notes, and photographed them. Second, we took the oral memory of the town seriously. Older residents gave us pieces of recollection, and the local museum allowed us to read fragments from taped recollections that had been recorded decades ago. None of those are a full, on-camera interview with a named surviving soldier. So what follows is a careful reconstruction, a dramatization assembled from the material evidence and the oral fragments we examined, labeled as such, intended to make the human experience intelligible without claiming literal verbatim testimony. Dramatization based on local accounts and archival fragments. I remember the mountain like a living thing. We were tucked into its belly. The world above screamed with wind and shells, sometimes both at once. The first weeks we thought of it as safe. The rails arrived in the dark, clattering like a herd of small animals, and men hauled crates that smelled of metal and oil. At night, the lamps were our whole sky. We slept on bunks that creaked and spoke. The rain would come through the fissures and we would laugh because what else could we do? There was a stove, a ridiculous thing for a cavern, and we boiled whatever we had until it tasted like hope. Sometimes I would go to the embrasure and look at the valley, and I would think of my mother's bread, and I would wonder how long we could keep living like this. The orders came, the supplies came, and the mountain kept our secrets. When it was over, we boarded the doors and walked away, and someone burned a list of names so it might look like nothing had happened. But you could still find the traces if you looked. A carved date, a crate with a stencil, the footprints in the dust. If you asked us, many of us talked. Later in bars, in the village, in the quiet of old age. We told the stories until the words frayed. End of dramatization. That passage is not presented as a literal transcription of any single individual's testimony. We make that explicit because integrity matters here. The mountain holds traces of many lives, and that dramatization stitches them into one thread, so you can feel the scale of living in such a place. In the video, we list the sources that inspired the reconstruction. Photos of graffiti dated to the late 1930s and early 1940s, crate markings we documented on camera, and a set of oral fragments we examined in the town's local archive. Those sources are cited on screen and linked in the description for anyone who wants to dig deeper. After the dramatization, it's worth stepping back to parse what the physical evidence actually tells us. The rail line, for instance, implies regular resupply. Narrow gauge tracks like the ones we saw are built when repeated movement is anticipated, not for a one-off hiding place. The presence of multiple storage rooms and ventilation systems indicates sustained occupancy, possibly rotated garrisons, and the logistical capacity to store food, ammunition, and fuel. The embrasures and pillboxes suggest a defensive posture aimed at controlling approaches from below, not merely observation. The architecture's robustness, reinforced gates, multi-layered blast shields, redundant corridors, means it was built to endure bombardment and to keep living operations running inside. Yet archives are different beasts. In the municipal records room, we found paperwork that looked bureaucratically indifferent. A thin file with dated stamps and margins, not a full construction dossier. It appears some central records were either minimal or dispersed. That dispersal is not necessarily proof of a deliberate erasure. It is often the administrative reality of border installations built in haste between world wars and later folded into larger military catalogs. But in practice, the result is the same. To the casual reader of public histories, it becomes as if the place never mattered. Part of the fading is also social. Village memories change. Older residents sometimes recall a bakehouse or a warehouse on the mountain without military context because memory blends over time. New generations look at a summit and see a park or a vista. The past becomes a landscape accessory until someone goes looking. Our job was to go looking, to piece together the physical puzzle and, where possible, to give voice, carefully, to those who lived it. I want to be very clear about ethics and safety. We did not force entry into sealed rooms, we did not move heavy doors, and we did not attempt to recover artifacts under the pretense of salvage. Dangerous items, suspected ordnance, heavily corroded metal, or spaces with poor ventilation, were photographed from a safe distance. If you find a site like this, the responsible choices are to document what you can from safe vantage points. Notify local authorities if the site is vulnerable or contains hazardous material, and work with museums or local archives to ensure material is preserved. These places are historical records. They deserve research, respect, and sometimes excavation by qualified teams, not social media daredevilry. We also considered the broader context. Why would a nation build such a complex here in the first place? The answer is geography and history. This mountain sits along a contested border that, through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was a focus of fortification. The French military in particular invested in a network of defenses across border ranges to guard against incursions and to control key passes. Engineering strategies favored subterranean works when artillery and air power made exposed fortifications untenable. Building into the mountain preserved firing positions, storage, and command spaces while taking advantage of natural concealment. The result you see is an architectural compromise between defensibility, supply logistics, and the realities of local geology. But building is one thing, memory is another. After the war, strategic needs changed. Some sites were deliberately stripped of useful components. Others simply rotted. Budget priorities shifted as governments rebuilt civilian life. In some cases, post-war treaties and reclassifications rendered certain installations redundant, and their records were archived under different headings or placed in military files sealed from the public. That paper shuffling has an erasing effect. A place can be literally present on the landscape but absent from popular history. Beyond bureaucracy, there's a cultural erasure. The trauma attached to military infrastructure sometimes pushes communities to forget, to pretend that the mountain was always only pastoral. That doesn't mean the place never mattered. It means the memory is complicated. Oral histories we collected in the village were often fragmentary and saddled with emotion. People remember fear and hardship rather than technical details. Those recollections are valuable because they are human, but they rarely satisfy a historian's appetite for dates and construction plans. That gap between lived memory and administrative record is exactly where the sensation of erasure thrives. We took time to document specific finds because concrete artifacts anchor narratives. A carved date in a stairwell. We photographed a 1939 inscription, links an occupation to a moment. The rail spur and the loading platform anchor the scale of supply. The kitchen chimney tells us people cooked here. A stamped crate, even when largely illegible, points to supply chains. Those elements taken together create a composite testimony that someone, many someones, lived here, and that their lives can be read if you know how to look. When we left the tunnels and climbed into the sunlight, the change was immediate and almost disorienting. The world outside the mountain buzzed with insects and distant traffic, and the village chimed with ordinary life. We sat on a rock by the tree line, drank the last of our water, and watched the mountain breathe. There was a sense of leaving a body behind, not of death, but of a busy, intensive presence that time had rendered quiet. The pillboxes watched like the eyes of a retired giant. So was this place erased from history? In one sense, yes. Its absence from easy reference and popular maps has made it invisible to everyone who doesn't live nearby or research deeply. In another sense, it was never erased. It was simply archived into thinner, less accessible layers. The people who lived here, who ate and sweated and scrawled dates on bunk posts, left traces that survive if you read them. In that fragmentary survival, we can say that someone did live long enough to talk. Not necessarily into our camera, but into the archival record and into local memory. Their voices survive as dents in concrete and the sediment of a flooded corridor. Before we close, a few practical points for anyone watching who feels the stir of curiosity. First, respect the law and the land. Many of these ruins are on private property or within protected zones. Second, do not attempt to remove artifacts. That is theft and destroys context. Third, if you find ordnance or suspect artifacts, contact local authorities. Fourth, support local museums and archives. The town archive we consulted had a handful of recorded fragments and a volunteer curator who does extraordinary preservation work for little pay. Those institutions are where the fragile voices of places like this survive. On a final note, I want to underline something that surprised me. Erasure is rarely malicious in the sensational sense. It is often practical, bureaucratic, and generational. Historians and archivists sometimes shrug and say the records are thin. Budgets and priorities do the rest. But that does not diminish the human stories embedded in the masonry. If anything, the scarcity of formal record makes the physical traces more precious. They are testimonies that wait under dust and lichen for someone to listen. We left the summit with more questions than we arrived with. and that is the right result. The mountain had given us a map of absence and presence at once, architecture that spoke of logistics and living, a complex that supported many lives, and a town whose memory keeps pieces of the tale alive. Our dramatization stitched those pieces into a human voice, so you could feel the dimensions of living underground. And the documents and artifacts we filmed are available in the description if you want to see the raw material yourself. If you want more deep dives into lost military sites and the human stories folded into them, tell us where you think we should go next in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss the next expedition. Thank you to the folks in the village who spoke with us, to the small municipal archive for opening their drawers, and to Emily for carrying extra water when I optimistically thought we didn't need it. History is not only written in books, sometimes it is written in concrete, in rust, in carved initials, and in the stories whispered over kitchen tables long after the cannons fall silent. We go to places like this not because they are romantic, but because they are human.